In a moment, you're going to see the latest World Championship game. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting the channel via PayPal or Patreon. You'll find the links in the video description. Let's take a look at Game 8 of the World Chess Championship. Remember, going into this game, Magnus Carlsen was one game up. Game 7 was not a thriller. The players obviously very tired after that marathon Game 6. So, were they rested enough to produce something brilliant in Game 8? Let's take a look. So, Magnus Carlsen, the world champion, with the white pieces. So, he went for e4, returned to e4, and Nepo went for his Petrov again. Solid opening. Now, we saw Carlsen go for knight takes pawn in previous game. This time he went for d4, which is another of the main lines. So just advancing in the centre, a very logical move. You want to develop quickly. Knight takes pawn, bishop d3. This is the main line, so attacking the knight, which is defended by the pawn, and knight takes pawn. So almost a symmetrical position, but white, of course, has an extra move. That bishop stands well on d3, and that gives some chances for white. But it's a very theoretical position. It's all been worked out extremely well. And here, knight c3 is the main move. But, I mean, recently black has been doing pretty well against that. Carlsen played knight takes. And this is a very old continuation. Castles is the main move here. But instead, Carlsen went for knight d2, which is quite a tame move, quite a rare move. But basically, this invites an exchange of pieces. And I think this is an indication that Carlsen was still pretty tired and wanted quite a calm game, actually. Nepomniachtchi exchanged knights on d2. That seems very reasonable. You can see it's the pawn structure is absolutely symmetrical, and if there are going to be a lot of exchanges in this position, it'll end up in a draw. But Carlsen just very slightly better here because he has that extra bishop move. So generating winning chances for black here is very difficult. Perhaps the cleanest move here is queen e7 check, but bishop d6, well, you can see it's absolutely symmetrical. But actually, after castle's kingside, this is not an easy position for black. So if black follows suit, then this is not just a dead draw. Then, for example, white could play queen h5, threatens checkmate, also threatens that d-pawn, so black should play f5. But white has a little advantage here because you can see white gets to the e-file first. There's a chance to play the bishop back to f4 and try to use that weakened square on e5. So the obvious move, castles, does not guarantee an easy time for black. So Nepomniachtchi thought for, well, over 16 minutes on this move and played very creatively. He played h5. And that's certainly an indication that, you know, he was wanting to play something a little sort of non-standard in this position and, you know, generate, you know, an interesting position, get an interesting position on the board. It might not be that accurate, it might not be that good a move. But, you know, if Carlsen is playing in a very quiet way, then, you know, that certainly livens up the game. And here, c4 is probably a decent chance for white. I mean, it's very complicated, but Carlsen said afterwards that he just couldn't calculate properly. And instead, he played queen e1 check after 40 minutes thought. That is a big think. Remember, the players have 2 hours to get to move 40, but, you know, thinking 40 minutes is quite a chunk of time. They're only on move 10. Queen e1 check. Now this is a very pragmatic move. Basically it invites an endgame. So if black plays queen e7 here, then white can just exchange queens and go into an endgame, and it'll probably be a draw. But Nepo clearly wanted to play an interesting game. Played king to f8. Very interesting. So he's still looking perhaps to get some kind of initiative on the king side. But it's a risky move, of course, because when the king doesn't castle, that means the rooks are split and coordination is potentially a problem. But it's an interesting move. But now bishop b4 is very sound, exchanging off that powerful bishop on d6. So queen e7, that's necessary. Now, if Carlsen wants to just bail out and make a draw, he can just exchange queens now, but now he doesn't need to. He exchanged bishops and just played the queen here, preparing to put a rook on the open file. There is no need for Carlsen to make a draw here, because already this is a little bit uncomfortable for black with that king here. As I said, you can see when white castles, the rooks are connected. That's very nice. They can come to the open file. It's not so easy for the rooks to support each other when the king is standing in the middle. This is the problem. So already this is a little bit uncomfortable for black. You know, if you try to make a move like this to bring the king to g7, then f4 and then f5, you can see white is active here. White has some attack. So rook e8 played by Nepo, reaching the open file. So rook a e1. Now, you know, black needs two moves here, g6 and king g7, in order to support that rook with the other rook. It's just not possible. Now, probably black should just exchange here and go g6 anyway. I mean, it takes time for this rook to come into play, and white, you know, has chances to get the initiative there. But that's got to be the most sensible way for black to play. Instead, Nepo continued in this very unorthodox way, bringing up the rook at the side of the board. Now, this is usually really frowned upon, and it does look a little bit strange. Queen g5 is a good move. Now, that prevents the rook moving into the middle because that pawn could be taken. And it's a nice active move anyway. And if the queen is attacked, then the queen is just going to drop back and that rook looks really silly. So queen g5, c6 played. Carlsen exchanged rooks and played the other rook to e1. So you can see how this one is a little bit shut out of play, whereas Carlsen's rook occupies the open file. So it's already a slightly tricky position for black to defend. Queen f6 offers an exchange of queens. Of course, Carlsen avoids that. There were some interesting options here for white. Carlsen dropped the queen back to e3. He could also have played queen g3 here. That's a very tricky move, but queen e3, very sensible. Of course, attacks the bishop, which came to d7. h3 is a very tidy move. There's no need to rush things. There's nothing on immediately for white, and that just controls this square and gives the king some luft here. An escape square off the back rank. h4, so that just cramps the king a little bit. I mean, it's not really an attacking gesture, but it could be useful later on to cramp the king. So Carlsen now breaks open the middle with pawn to c4. If he's going to get anything in this position, he really needs to try to stir things up while this rook is really out of play. So pawn takes pawn, bishop takes pawn, and this is a little bit uncomfortable. You can see now this bishop has found a nice diagonal here. But it's still not that bad for black. You know, black's pieces, yes, they're a little bit misplaced, but there's nothing on immediately for white. You know, pawn to a6 should be considered, for example. Potentially king g8 as well, just to try and tuck the king out of the way. But here Nepo played a really unfortunate move. Pawn to b5. This is an outright blunder. I mean, it looks a very strange move to my eyes to just advance this pawn and sort of break up these pawns a little bit. It looks reckless, but it just so happens there is an immediate tactical refutation. Queen a3 check. Checks the king, attacks the pawn. And the point is this, that after, well, however black defends, it's problematic. So, for example, queen d6, that pawn can be taken. Because if pawn takes bishop, queen a8 check, and it's going to be mate on the back rank. I mean, black can interpose the pieces, they just get taken. In fact, king g8 played by Nepo, but queen takes a7 anyway, and if pawn takes bishop, then queen takes bishop. White is just a pawn up for nothing, and still with excellent pieces. So basically, queen takes pawn wins a pawn because that bishop is attacked. Black, well, doesn't have time to take that bishop, basically. So this is a very unfortunate situation. It's a clear pawn down for black. Queen d8 played to protect the bishop. Bishop b3. The bishop maintains its position on this superb diagonal, and it's just very unpleasant for black. Rook d6. And here is a very good move from Carlsen. Rook e4. So it protects that pawn, puts a bit of pressure here. But here's the point. If g6, you know, black would still like to just bring that king up, then rook f4 combines with the bishop, and that is fatal, absolutely fatal. Black is just completely overloaded there. Nepo played bishop e6. I mean, it's a horrible position to defend. There really isn't much better. And Carlsen gladly exchanged pieces. So they've now reached a queen and pawn endgame, where white is a clear pawn up. It's not just that extra pawn. It's the fact that these pawns are really weak. The king is exposed. That one's a bit loose as well. And if black does nothing, then white is just going to create an outside pass pawn there. It's really nice for Carlsen that his king is so safe. That makes life much easier for white, just generally in queen and pawn endgames. Black has a lost position, but of course Nepo was not going to give up. He's thrashing around with his queen, but basically it's to no avail. A check. Queen takes pawn check. King goes in the corner. Queen e8. You can see that because black's king is exposed, it means that white has all these checks that allows the queen just to bounce back into a nice central position. And now white is 2 pawns up. White can win so many different ways. Carlsen took his time. He was very steady. He used all his time. He didn't rush it. He was just very, very careful. I mean, here he just took that pawn on b5. Came back with the queen. The queen is in the perfect position there, stopping any checks. So the king is completely safe. Queen check. And here it's possible just to take that pawn, just have an exchange of pawns and just use that d pawn. I thought that was the simplest. Instead, Carlsen just kept everything tight. So he's protecting that one. Queen f2. Now I've got to watch out for the checks here, but Carlsen covered with queen here. The point is that after the check, there is no check there and no check here. That was the point of playing the queen to c3, to cover that square. So basically the king is still completely safe, and now Carlsen is ready to push his pawns. Well, not quite anyway. King h7, queen d3 check. And he covered that square with the queen. Now he is absolutely ready to push his pawn. The king, again, there are no checks. The queen covers here, and now, having got everything absolutely perfect, the queen covers this pawn, and that pawn is ready to roll down the board. So very, very carefully played by Carlsen. Now Nepo thrashed around with g5. The pawn advanced. So if the queen just falls back passively, it's hopeless. So Nepo thrashed around with his pawn. And here Carlsen took that, and that's fine. In fact, he could have pushed on. Let me show this. This is a very neat win, actually. And after pawn takes pawn, queen check again. If the king moves to the f file, then queen f3 exchanges queens and forces a winning king and pawn endgame. And if the king comes the other way, then white just picks up all the pawns, and that forces another winning pawn endgame. There we go, forces an exchange of queens, and of course that's completely winning for white. So he could have pushed on. Instead, well, it didn't take him long to take that one. He's now 3 pawns up, and queen f3 just covers everything. Here, Nepomniachtchi resigned. If pawn takes pawn, check, king takes. I mean, black can give a couple of checks, but now white is 3 pawns up, and basically it's very easy. For example, g5, and the king can just wander in. Everything is protected. And of course, if queen takes pawn, queen g4 reaches a winning pawn endgame. So this was that's the final position. This was a very strange game. Nepomniachtchi clearly wanted to avoid going into some kind of early draw after this move. Queen e1 check. He could have just played queen e7, but just didn't want that, and said afterwards that he thought, well, this wasn't dangerous, and he wanted to sort of keep an interesting position on the board. Well, in fact, it gave Carlsen some chances, and later this move b5 was a terrible mistake, and Nepo looked very tired during this game. So, well, the spirit was willing, but the flesh was weak, and Carlsen was a very grateful recipient of a gift in this game. So some very poor choices by Jan Nepomniachtchi. Let's look at the scores. Here we go. Magnus Carlsen, world champion, now leads by 5 games to 3, and there are only 6 games remaining. It is going to take a Herculean effort from Jan Nepomniachtchi to get back into this match. They have a free day tomorrow. That's much needed by both players. They looked extremely tired. And then they will play Game 9 on Tuesday, 16:30 Dubai time. Don't forget, do check out the coverage, live coverage on chess24.com. The Oslo studio, very entertaining. That's the English channel. And there is Judith Polgar for a deep dive into the position, also on Chess24. And she is doing a wonderful job of hosting that broadcast. Fascinating insights into the game. So, rest day on Monday. Do join me again on Tuesday for another recap. But Magnus Carlsen looks to be in a very, very strong position in the match.